Well, tomorrow sees the start of the 7th Asia House Film Festival here in London, featuring films from across Asia-Pacific, from Cambodia to Myanmar to Japan and Uzbekistan. The theme of this year's festival is New Generations. Well, in a moment I'll be asking the artistic director Jasper Sharp what it means. But before we do that, let's take a look at the Indonesian film that'll be opening the festival, In the Absence of the Sun.
How are you?
Kamu gemukan deh.
Naik banyak dia. Di Amerika kan porsinya gede-gede, Beb.
Hitam lagi. Ayo, ini ada rainbow cake. Yuk makan. Lagi hit di Jakarta nih.
Thanks, Tante.
Lagian jam segini kok kamu baru bangun?
Masih jet lag, Tante.
Well, Jasper Sharp now joins me in the studio. Welcome to the programme, Jasper.
Thanks.
A very exciting time to be involved in Asian films in this country, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, there's a lot of interesting industries coming up in places like Cambodia and Indonesia, as you say, and it's a new generation of filmmakers. Well, that's one of the ideas behind the theme of this festival. You know, all the directors we're featuring, this is like their first or second feature. So this is the sort of emerging talent from across the whole region.
So the theme of this is New Generations.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? I presume that's talking about the writers and the directors and the actors.
Yeah, in parts, but also I've had this idea that I think we've seen very big changes across the world film industry with the sort of introduction of digital technology, so digital filmmaking technology, but more importantly digital exhibition technology and transmission. So it's a lot easier to get, firstly for filmmakers to get to see the film, to make the films, but also for audiences to get to see them. But I think that's bringing a sort of a new voice, a new fresh sort of way of looking at you know, filmmakers looking at their immediate environment.
So we just saw a clip from In the Absence of the Sun, which is by an Indonesian writer-director. So it's a drama that takes place on a single night with 3 women. Tell us about it.
Yes, I mean the 3 women, they're sort of paths intertwined, but they're sort of disconnected stories. Really, it's looking at this idea of culture shock within your own culture. This takes place against the backdrop of this very rapidly modernising Jakarta. And, you know, a lot of the characters are just feeling sort of alienated and out of sorts with it. So it's sort of got an ironic look, sort of whimsical, slightly bittersweet, but very touching. And I think it's universal as well, because I think it's not just, you know, very rapidly modernising cities, but, I mean, across the world now. I mean, you just look at London, for example. I mean, it's changed so much over the past 5 years that, you know, a lot of people are just looking around and saying, wow, slow down.
Yeah. I mean, I've had a look at some of these films that we're going to be talking about, and there does seem to be a theme that yes, there are very strong storylines, very strong stories, but they are very much about the place where they are set, aren't they? They're very much about the country that they take part in.
Yes, I mean, that's certainly something I wanted to, you know, evoke with the selection, to get, you know, give a real sort of vivid portrait of countries that probably a lot of us aren't that familiar with.
I mean, Yangon Calling, punk in Myanmar, that does sound brilliant. I love the idea. Tell us the idea behind that.
Well, it's a documentary made by 2 Germans, and it was really, I think, you know, it's only just recently sort of opened up to tourism in Myanmar. And one of the filmmakers was there a couple of years ago, and he noticed that these punks with Mohicans and studded leather jackets sort of wandering around the streets, and suddenly realised there was this massive sort of subculture that had been around since the 90s that had sort of emerged through cassettes of UK punk bands like The Clash and Exploited that sort of were snuck into the country. And
so they were actually smuggled in, weren't they?
Yeah,
basically smuggling in cassettes.
That's right. Sort of emerged, like, I think
so
it was
have their fix of being a punk.
That's right. So it was a true underground movement, and it's sort of emerged into this sort of quite burgeoning scene now. I mean, it's still very sort of countercultural, and it's actively, I think, actively suppressed. It's very difficult for the bands involved to give concerts or to sell their music, and yeah, I mean, it's you know, it is pure rebel music.
But it's a brave thing to do, isn't it? First of all, for the punks themselves, they really are a rebel with a cause this time round, but also for the documentary makers, because they had to use hidden cameras.
Yeah, I think it was all shot very surreptitiously. So, but you get a real sort of, you know, you really feel embedded within the sort of milieu with this film.
OK, let's look at the last reel. This is one that I think is very interesting. It's about a woman, on the surface then, it's about a woman who is seeking to find a missing reel of old film. What's on the missing reel of old film? Why does she want to find it?
Well, basically, it's a woman, she stumbles into an old cinema and sees this sort of poster on the wall of, like, this film, you know, made in the 60s, and the poster has her mother on it. And she was going, my mother never told me I was an actress. She was an actress. So they find the film, but the reel is missing. So the goal of the film is to sort of recreate this final scene. Really, it's a comment on, you know, the differences between Cambodian cinema today and in its heyday in the 60s. And what it really draws attention to is what a massive sort of cultural scene there was in Cambodia in the 60s. I mean, we only think of it in terms of Pol Pot and the killing field. But you know, during the 60s, there was such a vast sort of cinematic culture, music. The Cambodian pop music was like massive, very Western cosmopolitan influence. And I think that's it. Cambodia is now sort of re-emerging from this sort of dark shadows of the Khmer Rouge regime, and sort of, it's going to be a really exciting place to keep one's eye on, I think, in the coming years.
Does Uzbekistan really have a film scene, do we think?
Yes, there are films being made there. I mean, the film that we're showing is a 1972 film, so it's from the Soviet era. So
it just seems quite an odd country to actually have a film scene.
Well, this is what really intrigued me when I was looking at the programme for this year's Asia House. You know, we always think of Asian cinema in terms of Hong Kong, China, Japan, India maybe, but all the usual suspects. And I really wanted to expand this scope and look at, you know, the whole Himalayan region, the former Soviet sort of states. And yeah, I mean, we call it a Western, this film, you know, a red Western, but I mean, really it was made in the communist era. And though it draws on all the sort of tropes and the iconography and that sort of style of the Sergio Leone sort of spaghetti Westerns, for example, I mean, it is set really rooted within its own culture.
The films that I've picked out from the list are fairly heavy, meaty pieces. Is that just because those are the ones that I've picked out? Are there lighter ones there as well? Are there rom-coms? Are there lighter things for people?
I mean, I hope they're not heavy I mean, they're accessible, I hope. Yeah, I mean, certainly things like Flashback Memories, which is a music documentary about a Japanese documentary about a didgeridoo player who has amnesia after a traffic accident. You know, and it's a very tragic story, but I mean, what you're getting is set against the whole backdrop of his performances with didgeridoo and this great percussion ensemble. And you know, it's you know, really quite exhilarating to watch this film.
But he can still play the didgeridoo.
He can still play the didgeridoo. He can't remember what he had for breakfast yesterday. But
I think I'd rather know what I had for breakfast and not manage to play the didgeridoo. So very briefly, when is it on, where is it on, and how can people come? OK,
well, it's starting tomorrow. At the opening gala is at the Ham Yard in Soho, but then we move on for the weekend to Rich Mix in Shoreditch, and we have 6 slots there, and that's really the main event. And then Tuesday is the Myanmar, Punk in Myanmar, Yangon Calling, and another film, Jalanan, an Indonesian music doc, at the Horse Hospital in Russell Square. And then we move to the Cinema Museum in Kennington for a second screening of The Seventh Bullet, but most importantly, the Mongolian focus. There's a big retrospective of Mongolian cinema on the 19th of April. So the Mongolian stuff is really interesting because, you know, I mean, most people don't know about the Mongolian film industry, so this is a really great chance to get acquainted with it.
Absolutely. Jasper Sharp, thank you very much indeed for coming to join me.
Thank you very much.